I have permission to begin? Okay, I've been told to announce that due to the inevitability of academic loquaciousness, lunch will be postponed by a little, but we'll get there. And I will try to rush things through. I studied Japan, but I'm genetically more German, so I like rules and following rules and making rules. So I'll hold up signs when my speakers start getting near their limit and start throwing things at them if they ignore me. So I'm very happy to be asked to moderate this second panel. And I'm excited about the theme of a lot of the presentations throughout the day and particularly on this panel. This idea of investigating sort of the way that we study Japan and various aspects of Japanese culture and society, and the continued usefulness and also the varied approaches to kind of an area studies approach versus one that is more global, more comparative. I'm a political scientist myself, so this battle over area studies has been waged for quite a while. But Japanese studies, at least in the social sciences, as I've looked at it most carefully, has been parochial in the following sense. It's not just that people who study Japan really only study Japan, or that was more the case 20, 30 years ago. But students of Japan inevitably compare Japan to the other place that they know something about, which is their own home country. And they may not be scholars of their home country, but they're citizens of their home country, and so they know something about it. And naturally, the largest literature for a long time was produced by American scholars, generally in American universities. For these scholars, the natural comparison was, of course, the United States. So everything that was different between Japan and the United States was immediately attributed to Japanese exceptionalism, Japanese uniqueness, Japanese exoticism. There was anything that didn't seem American must be indigenous to Japan and just unique. One of the most important steps in my own studies was discovering the British literature on Japan. Or I guess some of that discovery was trying to figure out why Stockwin was different from everyone else and realizing that he was writing from a different perspective. Of course, Japan's political structure is much more similar to Britain's than it is to that of the United States. So many of the features of the Japanese system that I was studying that seemed exotic and indigenous to Japan were simply business as usual for parliamentary systems such as the UK's. So while American scholars would argue about uniqueness, often British scholars would look at this debate and just sort of chuckle. Think, Americans really need to look to the East every once in a while as well. So American students really had three main literatures at their disposal: the American produced literature, the British produced literature, and Japanese, if they had Japanese. Increasingly, the scholarly community in Australia is flourishing as well, so not so bad for English speakers. But that still leaves countless scholarly communities whose insights and approaches are completely hidden for scholars who can't read the languages in which those are written. Unless researchers work in English or Japanese, wherever they're based, this Japanese studies community remains balkanized and insular, and we really don't talk to each other. So I'm very excited about today's panels. Naturally, all of today's presentations will be in English or Japanese, because we're limited, most of the audience. But the substance of the discussion is an important first step to a truly global community of scholarship on Japan. So I'm very happy about this. I will introduce our three panelists in reverse order, just because I want to. And then we'll follow the program in terms of the actual presentations. So Christopher Hughes is Professor of International Politics and Japanese Studies, Chair of the Department of Politics and International Studies, and Chair of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Warwick, clearly a man who has a hard time saying no. Chris is the foremost expert, as far as I'm concerned, and I think a lot of people agree with me, on Japanese security policy, military, foreign policy. His recent books include Japanese Remilitarization, a provocative title, and Japan's Reemergence as a Normal Military Power. I'm happy to welcome Chris back to UCLA. He was generous enough to come out to a roundtable that I organized last year, I think, or a year and a half ago maybe, called Japan in the World. Today, Professor Hughes will speak about Japanese studies in the UK, current challenges, and future prospects. And here I'm going to show my limited linguistic abilities. François Lachaud is Professor of Japanese Studies at the École Française d'Extrême-Orient. Is that close? Did you understand what I said? Okay. and EFEO Professor of Japanese Studies at the Religious Studies Department of the École Pratique des Études. That means higher learning. He's an expert on Japanese Buddhism and is currently a curatorial fellow working on an exhibit called Kobayashi Kyochika, Master of the Night, to be held in Washington, D.C. in 2014. Professor Lachaud is an expert on transcultural relations in East Asia, and his presentation today will be entitled, sorry, I must have deleted something. His presentation will be entitled, however it's entitled in the program, which I'm afraid I screwed up. I apologize. Last but not least, our third speaker comes from the even more foreign land of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Harvard University. Ted Gilman is the executive director of the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard. He's someone I've long wanted to meet, and I couldn't be happier he was able to join us here today at UCLA. Professor Gilman is perhaps best known for his book, No Miracles Here, Fighting Urban Decline in Japan and the US. His talk will be on the promise and challenges of digital initiatives in Japanese studies. So I perversely announced our panelists in reverse order, just so I could get to that joke about Harvard being a foreign country. And now I recognize it wasn't worth it. But let's follow the program. We'll ask Ted Gilman to start us off, and then we'll hear from Professors Lachaud and Hughes.
Thank you. And Mike, for those in the know, the H is silent in Harvard, so but that's okay. We won't hold that against you. Nothing else is silent. Yeah, nothing else is silent, exactly. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me today. And Ted Bester is really the guy who should be up here since he's the director of the Institute. He's in Seoul right now doing some other stuff, so he sends his regards. So instead, you get the, what do you call it, the junior Ted before you today. I also want to thank this project, and what I'm going to present to you would not have been possible without a really generous Center for Global Partnership grant. So Chano-san and his outfit have been really instrumental in creating what you're about to see today. How many of you, where were you when 3/11 happened? You know, do you think about, how did you find out about 3/11? For most of us in the far-off land of Cambridge, it was early morning, we woke up, we opened our laptops or somehow connected to the electronic world, and were deluged with emails, tweets, Facebook posts, YouTube things, elements of communication through the in digital form. How many of you saved that stuff? Right, we didn't either. But we thought it would be a good idea to do so. And so what we've done is, and we've been working steadily to build this archive of Japan's 2011 disasters. And you can see the URL right down there. You are all invited to participate. You're invited to add to it. You are invited to join us in this effort. You'll notice that nowhere on here, is there any sort of membership? This is completely open source everything. And we encourage people in any language to join us. There's already some Korean and some Chinese content. Of course, there's a lot of Japanese. The majority is Japanese, but there's English content as well. So this is not a language-limited platform. For today, I really liked what Hitoshi said about going from a binary to a network model of interaction, because that's exactly what this is about. So let me show you how it works. First, how do you connect to the archive, or how do we connect the archive to everybody? This is a general schematic of what the archive is. And we've been working with all these partners listed in yellow, all of whom have really great content. Some of it is images, some of it is videos, some of it's testimonies, tweets, emails, websites. And we basically are creating a search engine specialized focused on the disaster to get all of the materials from these groups. And you'll notice that some of these are big international groups, some of them are national, and some of them are actually quite small. This is what the, let me go to the English side here. If you open it up, this is what you'll see. In the top right corner, you'll see some red circles that I've tried to put up there to highlight what what I'm trying to walk you through. Click on English, and the whole thing is converted. It's bilingual. It's a bilingual site as much as possible. The idea here is we've been working on this for a couple of years. It's now at the point where people can use it in classes and for research projects. And we're encouraging people to do so and give us feedback of how it could be made a better and more useful site. These three images that we have here are sort of are typical of the kinds of interrogations that people have done of the data. Asking about food safety and the food supply in Fukushima, how you do general rebuilding and relocation in the middle, and also, as you know, Ted Bester is the man of the Tsukiji fish market, and he's been very interested in the Minami Sanriku fisheries, and so he put together a collection. So collection is an important word. Just kind of keep that in your mind and table it. You want to explore it, you click Explore in the top left-hand corner, and this is what you get. You'll see that there's about 1.2 million items in the collection. That's an overwhelming number. Most of those, believe it or not, are tweets. And one of the things we've tried to do is find a way to filter out some of the stuff that will be less interesting. Tweets are useful, but only to a very specific kind of research. So trying to narrow it down some, we type in a search term, Fukushima, which goes up there. You can do it in English or Japanese. It doesn't matter. Thank you. Hit go, and it quickly whittles down to 61,000 items. Well, that's still an overwhelming number, right? I mean, if I'm an undergrad and I'm looking at writing a paper on Fukushima and I've got 61,000 items, I'm not a happy camper right now, especially if the paper's due tomorrow. So what we're going to do is try and narrow it further by going up and narrowing the format. And you'll see that all the different formats that are here, and I'll just kind of blow through this because there's some other stuff I want to mention in my final 5 minutes. Tweets were such a burden to this archive that we basically put on the top of our menu, exclude tweets, okay? Because most of us just don't really care. It's not that we don't care, it's that we don't know how to use what's in the Twitter sphere right now. And if you do want to know, talk to Yo back there. Yo Kawano is our social media guru, and we've relied on him heavily. So excluding tweets, we get down to 3,000 items. Okay, now we're talking. This makes a little bit more sense. And excluding tweets and looking in English, we find a number of articles, a number of web pages. www on the left-hand side is an icon for, it's a web page. Let's say we're interested in the cattle shipment and the beef ban. We pick this out, we click on it, and what you have here is a record of, now this is obviously a newspaper article, but there are these things called tags that we have put in, or that people have put in. Whenever something is added to the archive, it needs metadata. It needs something that sort of tells the search engine when to throw it forward, when to throw it out to the searcher. So the gray words are those are the things that will trigger this item to be put forth from the archive. So there we go. There's also text of the contents of the article and a map down below. And all of this stuff is either added by the people who contribute it to the archive. So if you want to go see the original source, it'll take you to an archived version of this at Internet Archive. So let me just run forward a little bit. You can also do this for images. And if you search images for Fukushima, you're going to get a whole bunch of images. If you don't like to look at them in list view, you can see them in gallery view, and you can see them all set up like 4 or so, and the page gets very long because you got 6,000 items. We also have a map function. Fukushima is a big area. You want to know where in Fukushima these pictures are taken. You can just click on the map, and it'll show you each of those dots is an image. And you can zoom in to see, where, if you know certain areas that you're looking for, you can really zoom in and get quite a lot of detail. If you want to zoom in on a particular image, even, you can get some basic information and some metadata. Click on it, and it will show you as much information as we have about the image, or as much as the holder of the data has. Fukushima is a big place. Not all of it is relevant to the disaster, so you may want to, you may want to see different layers. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, there's a layer icon that pops up. You click on it, and let's go to only evacuation zones, and then it gets shaded with the no-go zone and some of the other lesser zones. I want to move through. So one of the things that's really important about this archive is participation. Got it. In a normal archive, you go to the archive, you look at what the archive has, you make a bunch of photocopies or take some notes, and you go home and write, okay? What you have here is the ability to add to the archive. So Ted Bester is not the only guy interested in fishing in Tohoku, okay? Other people are going to be interested. So he can create a collection. You have to log in. It's free, and it's easy. But he can create a collection and then add to the archive. If he's got websites or testimonials or any sort of images, you can just point to them, and there's an automatic sheet. If you click on add to the website, you get this page that comes up, and you contribute. You add the URL, you add as much metadata as you can, and boom, it goes into the archive. You can also create your own collections. See my collection on the right-hand side? It's a different archive in the sense that the more people use it, the better it gets. And the more content and the different ways you can cut what's in there will appear. And so that's sort of a key point here. Here's a picture of Winnie the Pooh that showed up in there, and it has no tags. But you can add a tag if you want. You can click on it and go ahead and type in Pooh. And if someone ever searches for Pooh, I guess it'll come up. But you could also add more serious. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, what this is. I'm sort of throwing this out there as a discussion topic, okay? 10 minutes does not do this justice. I could take the whole time, because there are a lot of other features here. But the point is, it's networkable. It doesn't say Harvard anywhere on this. This is something that we hope will be migrated back to Japan to be curated and held somewhere. I don't care where, as long as it's done for a long period of time. And the other thing is, got it. And the other thing is that we want to be able to make this available to as many people as possible. So with that, we can talk about the issues and challenges with it in the Q&A session. Okay?
I'm sorry, I'm the old-fashioned type, so I'm François Lachaud. Somehow this year it seems that my first name has become popular one more time, be it in Spanish or be it in French. I mean, it's not the name of the French president, obviously. And I'm not the Pope in no way, but I'd like to first thank people from UCLA, Professor Abe, Cindy Suzuki, for the precious help they've provided me. So I'm going to bring you back to the Stone Age. We've seen what you can do with digital archives, and it's very interesting. And in my talk, I used one of those pretentious words, hybridity. So I will offer you in 30 seconds one of the crucial issues in my talk, and then maybe after that, for 10 minutes, I will speak about various issues that we're confronted with. You all have in front of you that fantastic folder of UCLA. I encourage you to look at the first page where it says UCLA in the deep dark blue. And a dazzling display of modern heraldry. So you see UCLA, and it says, "Let there be light." Fair enough. Behind me, I thought that was the Brazilian flag, so I was looking for Ordem e Progresso, but suddenly it's still Fiat Lux. So where are the classical studies going? Because today we have Let There Be Light, but soon we won't have Fiat Lux in so many ways. So I'll start, and I'll show you a document to rest your eyes and say, what the heck is he going to talk about? So here's the only slide you'll have. Interdisciplinary area studies are defined as heterogeneous and interdisciplinary fields of research and scholarship belonging to a specific geographical or cultural region after having become increasingly popular in the US and Western scholarship in the wake of the Second World War, have been subject to much criticism, and that includes people like me, including by many specialists in the field, and they've experienced a steep decline during the period 1980 to 2000. The Social Science Research Council, the American Council of Learned Society, the French Center, which will be the equivalent Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique National Endowment for the Humanities, they've decided, which long was served as a national nexus for raising and administering funds for area studies, shut down their area committees, students, and scholars. Very quickly interpreted that as a massive signal for a drastic changing of the research environment. It should be noted that the rejection of area studies programs, Japanese studies being one part of them, was at its strongest in the social sciences, mainly political science and economics. Other disciplines in the humanities have continued to accord a spectacular rejuvenation in this domain during the second decade of the new millennium, aided in this, it is certain, by a renewed interest. We use the word globalization, but the first globalization, which is the globalization achieved by the Iberian empires and in their wake by British Empire. But when it comes to knowledge of Japan, of course, the Iberian empires are very important. And the emerging consciousness that the American or European continents are, after all, only provincial. I'm sorry to mention that. Japanese studies are starting to take into account this revival, or maybe to keep it local, this second awakening of area studies that look beyond geographical and epistemological limits of the field. The expansion of the field also benefited Japanese studies, as I said, but it benefited Middle Eastern studies, Near Eastern studies, American, Latin American studies, even European studies. The two institutions where I teach are postgraduate institutions, so you say mostly it would be like an Institute of Advanced Studies in the United States, vaguely based on the model you have of the IAS at Princeton. So we don't have the core competence of the undergraduates who appear when they reach us, it's already good or it's already too late. So you have to foster that knowledge and that sense that how many students do we have? So I just love the statistics presented by Professor Abe. I can just give you by memory. We have roughly more than 1,200 students at Paris universities who take Japanese start their studies in start learning the Japanese language. Every year you have 150 master degrees, and these people may move to our institution or may stay within the general framework of the university. And then that means a trickle of, it's not exactly a trickle, it's not torrential either, it's not a deluge like someone said, but 50, 55 PhDs a year in a country where at best you have 10 positions, if that. So that's one of the issues that has already been raised, and I will not focus very much on that in the time that I have left. I will focus mostly on my specialty. So what is it that I'm showing now? I think the future of Japanese studies, especially classical studies, but in general, cannot be limited to Japan. One of the good things of the people who did area studies, they were not known as that Orientalism. It's not a term of abuse. It's just that in the 60s, most scholars started to study Japanese, studied Chinese, or pick Korean, and so they had a competence in 2 languages. And then, of course, you can add on that, you can add Spanish, you can add Portuguese, you can add Korean. If you do Central Asia, you can do Manchu, you can do Mongol, if you do Buddhist studies, you have to do Sanskrit. These people looked old-fashioned, but they at least knew 2 languages. What I'm showing you is a manuscript. It's a copy of the manuscript when the Jesuits were expelled from Taiwan at that time. It's the first detailed treatise on tea that you have that's not Japanese, but that details far more about the tea ceremony, its connections, its isitonse, momentary seclusion from the world, and describes far more than what you have in Chakaeki or in Shasho. So one of the key documents to understand the history of the tea ceremony would be included in that Portuguese document. I could have done the frame with the famous biombos, or biombos, like the Portuguese say. Famous ones were used by the viceroys in Mexico, and the tradition of Tlaquillos also created Japanese. There was that Japanese input. That explains the hybridity in general in my title. What we're facing today, and I'm speaking, of course, mostly from my experience in France, in Japan for almost a decade and a half, but also in Taiwan and in southern China, is that it's very hard to work on projects when you don't have the core competence. So even in Washington, D.C., to find an expert on calligraphy remains almost impossible. So you have an art history department, which is very good. You have people that are really good curators. You have to tackle first-hand material. First-hand material means documents written in bungo, and mostly means looking at original documents, what the Japanese call shoshigaku, for example, like bibliography. And bibliography is a science, but somehow students don't want to invest maybe 2, 3, 4 years of their lives in a field where there are so little positions and say, well, I'm learning a different language than modern Japanese. It's going to take time, plus I will have to study all these strange characters, and maybe even have to indulge into a little bit of Portuguese, Spanish, and the most promising side of the field now is Russian. Because no one has studied what happened between Japan and Russia between the 17th, not like Watanabe Kyoji or people like that, but between the 17th and the 19th century. There's a huge production of knowledge by the Japanese. Most famous book would be Hokusai Bunryaku. But there's a huge production of knowledge about Russia by the Japanese and by Russian Orientalists about Japan. You need to know Russian to do that. So that's the very notion of hybridity I was mentioning. But when we come back to the example of calligraphy, if there's one thing that distinguishes Japanese civilization, it's the relation to the written sign. The same goes for China. It's not an art that is elite. I mean, everyone practices calligraphy. You can see sutras written on mountains if you go to China. You can see the same ones if you go, for example, in places in Ichikawa Prefecture or at the Mampukuji in Kyoto, where you see sutras written on stones. So a core knowledge that is calligraphy is today taken for granted, and no one is studying that. So I will stop to be a little bit preachy, but I still think that's one of the main issues, especially when it comes to Edo studies, is that relation with China, with what was called at one point Obaku culture. It's not so much the Zen input that came from China, is that they were working a bit like other centers of knowledge, like Chinese Cultural Center, where the Japanese literati started to learn, like you learn Elvis Presley in a karaoke, you started to learn Chinese, and you discovered that Chinese was a spoken language. It completely changed the knowledge horizon in Japan. Suddenly, the Japanese were fully incorporated in a wider world picture. And that first globalization is really hybridity. So concluding remarks, I don't see how many minutes I have left. You don't? No. 2, okay, that's fine. So what brought me to Washington, D.C.? I thought that's a very interesting thing. It hasn't been mentioned by anyone in the very kind introduction I had. Years ago at the Jimbun at Kyodai, one of my best friends was Professor Tominaga Shigeki, one of the most brilliant Japanese sociologists, asked me to be on the scientific committee of the publication of Tocqueville's selected works in Japanese. He did that for family reason because my mother is vaguely connected with the Tocqueville family. But he also wanted me to translate from the French a text called 2 Weeks in the Desert into Japanese. It's going to be published this year in September. And the main theme was the social history of emotions, melancholy and modern cities. And Melancholy and Modern Cities was the program that the Smithsonian asked me to take care of and to prepare that exhibition in Kobayashi, Kiyochika. So from that Shinshoban about Tocqueville by Tominaga, that very nothing to do with Japan, and as far as I know, Tocqueville never quoted Japan, never referred to Japan, he referred to China, and he referred to the dangers of worshipping a centralized state where literati ruled the world and which will end up in slavery and misery, but never mentioned anything about Japan. But that Japanese teacher, when we're starting to talk about melancholy, was interested in Fernando Pessoa and modern things, completing his Tocqueville education. My Tocqueville education was very limited, as you can tell, but still, the fact that you have to translate Tocqueville in a foreign language somehow taught me a lot about hybridity, and it even brought me as far as Washington, D.C. So who knows where's the next step? But the next step is definitely looking at Japanese studies from a different angle. And as a concluding remark, I've been busy this past 3 years with a project about art collectors, and those strange people called antiquaries. And the volume is going to be published by Getty Publications, so that's why I'm very happy to be in LA right now. But it's also very nice to be someone from the Japanese studies field or area studies, to be able to talk within a different context, to be able to talk with historians. And that's it. And thanks for your patient attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try and keep to my 10 minutes if I can. Like the previous two presenters and everyone else this morning, of course I'd like to thank Terasaki Center for inviting me back again. It was about 18 months ago, I think, when we did the event with Mike, and it was a really great experience, so it's very nice to be back. Yeah, I'm going to talk about UK Japanese studies, and I thought what I'd do is just outline some strengths that still exist in the UK, but so also some of the challenges that we are undergoing, and I think there's quite a lot of crossover with a number of talks that we've already had, and then just some sort of ideas about how we're trying to respond to these problems in the UK. I have to say from the outset that I'm not a head of a Japanese Studies Centre. I'm here as the president of the British Association of Japanese Studies, which is an academic association, which has about 300 members, and it's probably the largest national association in Europe connected with Japan. And I'm also here from my perspective as an academic at the University of Warwick, where we don't have a Japanese Studies Centre. So I'm kind of looking at the condition of Japanese studies